Good evening, everyone. The South Florida Writers Association is in for a real treat tonight. In the spirit of the upcoming scary season, we'd like to welcome you to our special October Halloween edition of the Authors Showcase series, a virtual experience. Hello, I'm Princess Beverly. Hey, it's Halloween, right? I am your host for tonight's show. Before I introduce our featured author, I'd like to share a little about us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit education and membership organization dedicated to the literary arts and support writers in our community. Our mission is to establish and maintain a forum for fellowship, education, and information among writers in the South Florida area. For more information, please visit our website at southfloridawriters.org. Tonight, we are pleased to welcome author and Fright Talk podcast show host, Dr. Billy Jones. As you know, Dr. Jones spearheaded our virtual author showcase after the COVID pandemic began in 2020. We are so grateful to him for his quick thinking and for creating a new platform to entertain our membership nationwide. Dr. Jones is an associate professor of English at Broward College and teaches English composition, creative writing, African American literature, and other specialty literature courses. Tonight, he will discuss how technology plays an integral role in podcasting. A new generation of horror writers and podcasters has arrived and are interested in exploring the next level to capture a wider audience of readers. Dr. Jones will offer his views on creating communities for these creatives so they can unleash their podcasting potential. Dr. Jones will also regale our group with a live reading of his latest short story featured on his new podcast show, Fright Talk. So please help me welcome Dr. Billy Jones.
The South Florida Writers Association's virtual October 22 showcase. Today, I'll be presenting to you a little taste of what I do in the horror podcasting world. Our conversation tonight is about horror podcasting, an on-ramp to reading and writing about horror. As an author for over 20 years, I love what I do. I've been an avid reader all my life. I love reading the ideas and inventions of others, but especially those ideas that are all associated with fear. And not just about the boogeyman or the boogie monster or the criminal that may lurk or live next door. I'm referring to those reality fears, the fears that haunt us and our insecurities in our day-to-day lives, as well as those that may be popular, such as objects of fear like haunted spaces and homes and objects like dolls. In the end, horror podcasting is here to stay. It's been around for a while, and for the past 2 years, I decided to venture into it. And what it has done for me has created this massive community of listeners and enthusiasts who are excited and willing to listen and hear and even more so communicate with me about my content. So a little about me in terms of what I do and where it goes. Fright Talk is my horror podcast. For the past 2 years, Fright Talk has been an exciting series where I and my co-hosts, we converse about a myriad of topics that are associated with horror. We like to say that we like to cover things all horrific and suspenseful. In addition, previous to that, Fright Talk was born out of Everyday Folks Radio, my original first podcast. So now I have 2 podcasts, one for Fright Talk for all of those of you who are interested in horror, but also Everyday Folks, where I have conversations with everyday people, authors, and others about the exciting, amazing things that they're doing. And if at any time you'd like to listen or camp on to any of my podcasts, there are your options on the screen, courtesy Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Spotify, just to name a few. And of course, the website. You can always visit us at frighttalk.com and billypauljones.com as well. And we'll put the logos up at the end. I'll put the logos up at the end of the video so that way you're able to capture. So just a little brief note about podcasting. It's important that you recognize that digital distribution of audio and video content via an electronic platform. For instance, I'm sure many of you use YouTube, or you may perhaps even communicate regularly via email. All of these are digital distribution options for sharing information. And how we share that information is shared via different file types, such as an audio file or a video file. Well, podcasting is a very special lane of its own because it allows us, courtesy of some of the previously listed logos that you saw and platforms, we're able to showcase and share, distribute electronically and massively to communities of interest, folks who are around the globe, not just locally in your own backyard, but around the world who are interested in hearing your content. And more authors are creating podcasts about their creations and other subjects of interest. So I encourage all of you members, not only the South Florida Writers Association, but writers of the community of writers around the world, to consider podcasting as another opportunity for on-ramping readers who will now become listeners of your content. And I must recognize that horror and true crime podcasts are very popular today. They're here to stay, and folks are very interested in them. And something to keep in mind that you'll probably see in the next slide is this. Horror fans are diehard fans, whether it be for a franchise or reading, such as a book or a novel or graphic novel, and of course, podcasting. So if you're interested in horror podcasting, it's really no different than horror writing, other than the fact that your delivery and modalities are distinct. And that's where it's important to recognize that you might need a few tips in order to make it happen. For me, before I even dive into this, I have to first understand what is the power of horror and what is horror to me, because horror as a big umbrella has so many subgenres within it that really define what it means. So to me, as I shared at the very opening, horror is about fear. And what it does is it really encourages humanity to focus on its fears, to address its fears, and find out ways in which we can relate to that fear. Sometimes our characters meet their demise. Others triumph and they find new ways or avenues to defeat the evil. But in truth, the fear doesn't always have to be the monster that is at the edge of the bed or hiding and lurking in the darkness in the closets. Sometimes that monster can be internal. And so therefore, if you're creating podcasts, especially or looking for horror podcasts, it's important that you recognize you're going to need a few tools in order to make sure that you create a consistent audience, in order to make sure that that audience is really not only supporting what you want, but also requesting things that you want. And I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize how true crime podcasts are amazing. I like to listen to them as well. I love to watch documentaries about them. In fact, they help inform my writing as an author. I'm currently working on my first short story collection of horror short stories based here in South Florida. And one of the things that I find by watching true crime is that it helps me remember or recall some very salient events or histories of events that have taken place in my own hometown or location. And it also informs me of new opportunities or gateways by which I can go on and create these new avenues and characters and circumstances that will just be horrifying. And so as a result, it's important that you recognize that podcasting has, there are some tips that I'd like to recommend to you for horror podcasting. Hi.
I'll take that.
Okay, you can come to the door. I'll meet you there. Hey, you got the food?
I'm gonna get it now.
All right, thanks, because he's waiting and I'm trying to record this. So here are a few horror podcasting tips that I want you to consider if you decide to dive into this particular genre of podcasting. Number one, I encourage you to use your imagination. Think of the childhood fears that you may have, especially if you're a new writer to horror. Think of those moments, perhaps like myself. I remember that I was very afraid of the dark, like impenetrable darkness. And so, how could I play upon that darkness to really create this atmospheric understanding of horror? And maybe the horror may not be in the darkness. Maybe I can project it into something else. Maybe it's a creature or another human, or maybe it's inside my head. So use your imagination. Start from a place of familiarity to build on that. And then decide on ways in which how you can embrace how fear is part of our reality. For instance, I recognize that every time I leave my home, every day, I'm taking a risk because it is my hope that I'll return back home. Notice how I just framed that? What I just framed could perhaps potentially be the greatest opening lines to one of my next podcast or short stories. But the key is to embrace fear as a part of reality. And because if you do so, you make it more relatable. That brings me to my third point, creating relatable content. Especially in horror podcasting, you want to make sure that you're creating a consistency in your audience, and therefore creating relatable content that people can relate to definitely keeps your listeners coming back. They'll continue to turn on those notifications inside their platforms like iHeartRadio or on Spotify to want to come back to you and see what that next episode is. And even more so, the consistency that you create helps you keep your focus as well. As I shared earlier, horror fans are diehard fans, so consistency is key. So for instance, if your stick in your horror podcast, or in any podcast for that matter, is all about interviewing individuals, then consistently stick to interviews and stick to a consistent format that people can relate to. For me, because I have two different worlds, one that is Everyday Folks Radio podcast that's been around for almost 5.5 years now, and then Fright Talk, which has now been around for about 2 years, a little over 2 years, actually a little over 2 years. What I've realized is that, keeping up with this could be quite a challenge, but it's an opportunity for me to recognize now that they're in two distinct avenues, I'm able to create content that is very specific to each. So in Fright Talk, I like to talk to individuals, whether it be my co-hosts, and shout out to my friend Nadine Tabs, who's one of my co-hosts for the show. We like to talk about all kinds of things like cryptids. Cryptids are those characters or folklore figures that many of us are familiar with. Good examples of them are things like the Mothman, Bigfoot, Chupacabras. They're all examples of cryptids. So cryptids are a great on-ramp because every culture has folklore, and some of that folklore may be dark or horrific. And so if you decided to stick to cryptids, then cryptids is your stick for the remainder of your podcast. Doesn't mean you have to do it eternally, but if you want to create a captive audience, you have to consistently stick to those types of topics in order to keep your audience consistent and consistently aware of what it is that you're trying to do. And that is deliver content in a specific lane. But you also, I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize it, you want to invest in quality podcasting equipment. I myself, as you can see probably from this video, have some pretty cool gadgets here. I always say try not to break your budget, but the one thing you want to make sure is that your audio quality is good. So having a good quality mic, having all the other bells and whistles that will help improve the delivery of what you do is important. And assuredly, you also want to make sure that you have a computer. It could be a laptop or a desktop that allows you to capture your moment. Now, keep in mind, podcasts now are coming in two forms. What I do in many of the platforms that I do my work in is all audio based. So folks are only listening to me. They can't see me besides what you can see now from me via this video. However, there are also video podcasts. I've seen now many horror podcasters are now not only taking their podcast and audio recording it, but they're also capturing themselves via camera at different angles of the room or space in which they're recording their moment of their audio. And they're uploading those options to YouTube. So it's now creating a new fan base of watchers / listeners of your podcast. And then lastly, just like any good writer should be considerate of this, you should also be an active listener of other horror podcasts. So I listen to a number of, as I shared earlier, horror podcasts and true crime podcasts. And I'm not listening just because I want to know what my competition is about. I'm really interested in the topics that they have. But even in the midst of that, especially as a creative, I can't help but be informed by the ways in which those podcasts do what they do, especially my favorite ones, because there's something I can gain from watching those or listening to those listening to those podcasts to find out ways in which I could inform my own podcasting abilities and techniques. But even more so, I'm just interested. I like to learn. I like to be scared. And you know what else? The cool thing about podcasting is that you could take it on the go. So whether your listener is working out at the gym, or they're driving on their way home in a long rush hour commute, or they're riding on the train, or they're on a road trip, your podcast can go everywhere your listeners go, which is why it's so super cool. And so, as I shared before, my podcast that you see by these logos is available on all of these platforms that are prescribed. I wanted to share something really cool with you that I'm beginning to launch now on Fright Talk. As I shared with you earlier, this is my favorite season. If any of you know me, you'll know that I am a horror fan. And this didn't just start overnight. It's always been with me. A little backdrop. My family, especially my grandmother and my mom, have always loved horror. And I was introduced to horror at an acceptable young age, courtesy of my grandmother in particular, who used to love to read Stephen King novels. So when I became of age and mature enough to understand and embrace those novels, this is primarily my latter final years of middle school, I began to read these novels. I began to also read other mysteries in middle grades reading, such as The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew. I was fascinated with thrillers, and I was fascinated by scary stories, even if they were orally told. And as a result, as I matured, I began to obviously create my own stuff, but I never felt like I was good enough yet to really produce my own creative works that were scary. I was much more in the earlier days of my life, much more interested in other people's inventions than creating my own when it came to scaredom. But as I went through college and then graduated and became a teacher, I began to really embrace my ability, my creative interests and creating and writing scary stories. So now as a result, podcasts it's a great avenue for me because I love to talk. And what I'm told from my fans of my books, they often tell me, my everyday folks books, that is, they like to tell me that, oh, you're so interesting, but the books are interesting, but after meeting you, it makes me want to read the books even more. And I thought to myself about 6.5 years ago, if that could work well for the things that I write, what about the things that I speak? And hence was born Everyday Folks Radio, and then later Fright Talk, which now are platforms that to me give me another creative outlet of energy for sharing my content, sharing my ideas, but even more so, it gives me an opportunity to connect with a new tribe of readers and creative supporters and the like, and listeners all the same. So what I'd like to do today, just to give you a little taste of what I do on Fright Talk, I want to read a new story. I have this new series that's going to be launching, where periodically on Fright Talk, I'm just going to record, and within 10 to 15 minutes, 20 minutes max, I want to release what are called, flash fiction stories that are 500 words or fewer, that are horrific and based on a particular topic. So this recent one that I just wrote, it's 250 words to be exact. And it is titled, You Should Have Stayed. So I'm going to read this story to you because I think that this story, as you can see, I'm here now virtually on a video podcast of sorts. But if I were to upload this, which I'm about to in the next week, it's going to be released. So South Florida Writers Association, this one's for you. This one was new and fresh off the press. The goal here is to provide an opportunity for this audio for a listening audience to listen. And that includes some sound effects and other clips to really give it dramatic impact. That's the cool thing about podcasting. It's almost like you're making these audio movies of sorts. So this story that you're about to read or hear rather, or watch from my lips is titled, You Should Have Stayed. Here goes. 10 minutes before 3 a.m., it returned, the scratching at my bedroom door. Before that, the intermittent knocking on the wall. I sat up in bed. A hollow voice whispered in my right ear, Victor, Victor. Before long, it was over. But the dead can see things, all things that the living tries to conceal. It was just an accident. Just before the break of dawn, all was discovered. Then the relentless scratching returned, more knocking. I remembered the screams before her car sank at the bottom of the lake, with her still inside. Victor, it whispered again, you should have stayed. So that story that you just heard, flash fiction, 250 words or fewer. Great on-ramps for creating a new listeners and also the skeleton to future stories if you decide to take your podcast and publish them into full books. I think flash fiction is a great opportunity as well to get some of those ideas that we writers sometimes have on the back burner of our minds, but we're ready to get out but anxious, but yet don't have the interest to do it or don't have the muse or inspiration to do it. So perhaps flash fiction can be an opportunity for on-ramping your stories into a podcast, especially for horror podcasting. So if you're not into horror podcasting, I hope that'll change because Fright Talk is here for you. However, though, I recognize too that if you're interested, those of you who are interested in just podcasting in general, at least starting one, you're welcome to always reach out to me. I'm available. My information is posted on my website. You can contact me there via Fright Talk at via www.frighttalk.com, as well as everydayfolksradio.com and billypauljones.com. And another thing I'd just like to share with you. It doesn't have to be during Halloween season when you creep people out. Because if you think about it, it's easy to think that the evil lurks in the darkness, as sometimes it shall. But sometimes the greatest of evils lurk among us in the day. And so as you begin to look at the ways in which horror podcasting can play a vital role in your creative work, I know for me, it does so much in informing what I do and what I potentially will create. But even more so, here's this. I recognize that I am not the same writer I was, for horror writing that is, ever since I started horror podcasting. Because I'm looking at things from different points of view. I'm researching, exploring. As a professor, I'm a professor as well, and I teach English composition. I teach specialty courses such as African-American literature and Caribbean literature too. And in those courses, I'm exposed to some very sensitive topics. Some of those topics are associated with trauma, such as slavery, right? Or other subjugations of communities, or such as during the pre-civil rights era, the subjugation of women and the like. So these are great opportunities for launching into horror, because there's fear in slavery. In fact, some would say that there's still a metaphorical slavery going on today, right? So what way could I take that and remix it into a horror story or a thriller story? Sometimes we recognize the thing that scares us the most is the most basic in concept, yet complex to resolve. And some of our darkest hours of human history can also serve as gateways for horror topics. So if you look in your family history, perhaps, or within your cultural community, you'll probably find other spaces where things that have gone on that have hurt people, traumatized, could be really cool elements to incorporate in a horror story. And if you're going to podcast about it, here's this. Keep in mind that although those topics are great, be cognizant of your triggers and warning signs that sometimes may come up because it may turn off some listeners and it may invite others. The key is at the end of the day, you have creative license to do and be who you want to be. So continue to do what you're doing, whether it be writing those stories or podcasting those stories or ideas, because eventually it's going to catch on with someone who is very interested. And furthermore, as I continue to grow as a podcaster in horror podcasting, that is, I don't want to be the same creative I was ever since I started this creative evolution. I want to be changed, if not impacted, by my own ideas and the ideas that I borrow from the universe to create the stories, both orally told and written, for audiences to enjoy. I'd like to thank the South Florida Writers Association for this opportunity. Truly, I encourage everyone to check out South Florida Writers Association. Our website is southfloridawriters.org. There you will find great information about our membership, our benefits, and as well as our annual conference, the Mango Writers Conference. And then also, if you have any questions related to horror podcasting or just horror, or better yet, you're just looking for a new buddy, you can reach out to me via my media options. I mentioned the website earlier, frighttalk.com, everydayfolks.com, and billypauljones.com. And on that page, you can also find my social media. I'm available on Instagram at drbillyjones. I'm on Facebook too under the same name. It's an easy name, folks, so you can't forget it. But I'm available, and I love connecting with other, not only readers and listeners, of course, because they keep me going. They fuel me and my interests, but also other creatives. It's important that we be each other's best customers. Until next time, enjoy the October 2022 season. Happy Halloween all, and stay safe.